So good evening everybody and welcome to our presentation of Burnside Unbound, where we bring our author events to you. Today we are privileged to have Adelaide-based author Sonya Bates. Welcome, Sonya.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate.
You're welcome. And a big thank you to our attendees who are zooming in on our conversation with Sonya this evening. Welcome to everybody out there. If you would like me to ask Sonya a question on your behalf during the webinar at any point, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Now grab your cuppa or a glass of wine and sit back and relax. So Sonya, again, thank you very much for your time this evening, and you must be so pleased with the popularity of Inheritance of Secrets. This morning I had a look at our statistics on the SA Public Library Network, and nearly every copy of your novel in our network is on loan, and that's over 60 copies that we have. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm just absolutely thrilled to hear that. It's so good to know that readers want to be reading it.
Yeah, so, and critics have welcomed this addition to the literary world. I've read an engrossing wartime mystery that crosses generations, gripping, tense, mysterious. Inheritance of Secrets links the crimes of the present with the secrets of the past and asks, how far would you go to keep a promise? So I'd like to start by asking you to give us a little bit of an overview of Inheritance of Secrets.
Sure. Inheritance of Secrets is a mystery, a crime thriller really, with a dual timeline. So the main character is Juliet, who is a 30-year-old writer who has been brought up by her grandparents since the age of 9. Her mother abandoned her. Her grandparents are German immigrants who moved to Australia after the Second World War. They've done quite well for themselves and built up a bakery business that and have 3 shops across Adelaide. So Juliet, we first meet Juliet as she's unfortunately at the morgue, walking down the corridor on her way to identify the bodies of her 2 grandparents who've been murdered. The only clue to the mystery is her grandfather's missing signet ring. And initially it's thought that it is a break-in gone wrong. Then Juliet's estranged sister, Lily, shows up, and she's thinking that she's being stalked and is fearing for her life. And Juliet starts thinking that there's more going on here than a simple break-in gone wrong. She starts looking into her grandfather's past and what significance this missing signet ring might have, and inadvertently digs up some World War II secrets that put both her and her sister's lives in danger. So that's the contemporary section. And the historical section follows Karl, the grandfather, as a young man. And we see him first in Germany in 1943 as he's turning 18, and he's been drafted and setting off the next day for training camp and then on to the front to fight in the war, to take up arms. And so it's his last night and he's saying goodbye to his sweetheart, Greta. And then we see him a few years later after the war has finished and he's been released from the POW camp. And he's disembarking from a train in Stuttgart. And there he meets Hans, who is an old buddy from his first unit when he first joined the forces. And Hans is doing unusually well for himself in a situation where people are just struggling to survive, to feed themselves, to find shelter and fuel to keep themselves warm. And he tries to talk Karl into leaving Germany and going with him to Australia. Karl is really reluctant at first because he doesn't want to leave Greta, who is still in Halle, where they grew up, but it's in the Soviet zone and Karl can't go there. Because if he did, then he would be taken prisoner by the Russians and sent to a Russian labor camp. And so eventually he agrees, and the historical section follows his journey to Australia and with Hans. I won't give away any spoilers, but let's just say that things don't go quite as he expected.
Mm. Yeah, from that point on, it gets very interesting as to the other characters who cross his path. So, you launched Inheritance of Secrets on the 20th of April, right in the midst of our lockdown as such. How did you celebrate the launch of this novel, Sonya?
Well, very quietly. It wasn't quite what I had expected. We did have a launch planned, but it was really got champagne with my family, my husband and my two girls, and a celebration with just the four of us. It was still really, really exciting, just not quite what we had planned in the first place.
As the regular viewers know, we've interviewed a few authors and that's been the case for them, but it usually involves a glass of champagne at some point.
Of course. And definitely I'm going to get together with friends once things open up a little bit more, and we'll celebrate with a little bit more fanfare. But
sounds like a good plan.
Yeah.
Would you like to read a section of the book to whet the appetite of our viewers tonight?
I would love to. So the section I'm going to read is from the start of the book, chapter 1. I'd never seen a dead body before. Sure, there'd been dead birds in the yard once or twice, dead cats on the side of the road, kangaroos on the highway, but nothing that mattered. Now, here I was, following a detective down a bare corridor at the Adelaide City Morgue, about to be confronted with not one, but two bodies, the bodies of my grandparents. My heels were loud on the concrete floor, the slow rhythmic clicking, the only sound in the passage. I didn't know what had prompted me to wear those shoes, some misguided notion of respect for my grandparents, but I regretted it now. We came to a door and I followed the detective into a small viewing room no bigger than a large cupboard, with a curtain along one wall. We'd left his colleague in the reception area, and now I understood why. There would be no room for the three of us in there. The detective was tall and bulky and seemed to fill the tiny space. He had a hair on his collar, a steel gray strand clearly visible against his dark jacket. I wanted to pick it off, to tidy him up for my grandparents. Take as much time as you need, he said. I stared at the hair and his eyes flicked down, but he couldn't see it. All right then? Yeah, I said, but no sound came out, so I nodded. He turned towards the curtain, found the draw cord and pulled. I don't know what I expected. The detectives had filled me in on what would happen, that the bodies would be visible through a window into an adjoining room, that they would be presented one at a time, that they would be covered with a sheet except for their faces. I was to identify them by name if possible. They'd told me the bodies had been found in my grandparents' home, in their bedroom, with the time of death estimated to be between 1 and 3 a.m. Who else could it have been? And that's it for now.
Yeah, that's something that nobody ever wants to have to do, but you've captured that, I don't know, just the grief in that moment really well, and of course the story launches on from there. One reviewer has written, with distinct character voices, a range of engrossing plot lines and a looping bridge between the past and the present. Inheritance of Secret is an engaging tale. So my question is, how do you get to something so complex from that very first idea that pops into your head about a potential novel?
Well, that's a good question. The idea for this novel really started with the fictional character of Karl, and he was inspired by my dad, who was also a German soldier. He grew up in Germany in the 1930s when Hitler was in power. So he would have had a lot of the same experiences that Karl would have had, being part of the Hitler Youth and participating in the Reich Labor Service, and just living those teen years knowing that when you turned 18, you would be taking up arms and going to war. And so the character of Carl really developed through my thoughts about my dad's experiences. As a child, I was really quite horrified to think that he'd been involved in something as terrible as a world war. And from my perspective as a Canadian, on the side of the enemy as well. And, you know, when I was 18, I was, you know, completely dependent on my parents and going to university. And just starting university, I always thought of my dad and I as having fairly similar personalities, and he was just a quiet, private, peace-loving person, and I just couldn't reconcile that with the thought of having to go to war. And then as an adult, and especially after I moved to Australia, I started thinking about when he moved to America, because he did leave Germany and he went to America in the 1950s. And as I learned more about post-war migration to Australia, I started wondering if he had experienced, you know, sort of prejudice and animosity when he moved to America, so shortly after the war. So it was those sort of thoughts that developed the character of Carl, and I knew that I wanted to write about Carl, but the idea beyond that just really wouldn't move forward. I had initially thought that I would write a purely historical novel, that it would be maybe a family saga or a migration story or something like that. And but I started doing some research, doing some broad research around, you know, the 1930s and what sort of conditions and times, experiences Carl would have had as a young boy and as a teenager, and the conditions after the war as well. But what actually really struck me was not so much the ideas for a migration story, but more just the fodder for secrets and mysteries within that time period. Obviously, there were the big secrets that go around war, sort of, you know, underground networks and secret codes and that sort of thing. But I was more interested in the ordinary people and the things that they might be doing, or, you know, in times of extreme circumstance like that, people do things, both good and bad, that they would never contemplate doing under ordinary circumstances, and things that they might not want to reveal after it's over, things they might want to keep secret, especially if they're trying to start a new life in a new country and they really want to leave all that behind them. And so that's when the contemporary story, the idea for that came to me. And I actually saw that first scene of Juliet at the morgue going to identify the bodies of her grandparents. And I just knew that that grandfather was Carl, and that something in his past had come back to haunt him. So I guess that's sort of where it started, and it developed from there.
Mm. So you talk about war, and often a lot of times the theme of war comes up in, the theme of separation and reunion come up in war stories, but would you like to elaborate a little bit on this without giving too much away?
Sure. There is a fairly strong theme of separation and reunion within a number of the characters, Carl and Greta, obviously, but also Juliet and Lily. They're separated and then brought back together, and Juliet meets up with an old high school friend that she has been separated for quite some time. So there's a number of relationships which have been broken by time and then come back together. And it's not something that I set out to write about, but perhaps unconsciously that sort of slipped in there, possibly because, you know, I've been separated for most of my adult life from my family and the childhood friends that I had. I left my hometown, I guess I must have been 23 or so when I first moved across Canada, and I haven't really lived in Victoria, where I grew up, since then. But every time I go back to visit family and friends, there are always a few people that, even if we haven't spoken for a very long time, you get together and it's like no time has passed whatsoever. You chat and you exchange stories, and you just have a great time, as if it had just been a week rather than 10 years, you know, or whatever. And even, you know, my husband and I, we had a period when we had a long distance relationship, and this was way back before instant messaging and even email. So we were writing letters back and forth, and it took 10 days for a letter to go from Canada to Australia, and then you had to wait another 10 for a reply. So maybe those things unconsciously slipped into the novel just because it is part of my life.
One of our attendees, Sandra, is asking about that she's fascinated by a mystery with a dual timeline, especially with an Australian flavour. And her question is, did you find you had to do a lot more research for the historical part of the plot than the contemporary part with the police aspects?
There was a lot of research for both aspects of the novel, for both sections of the novel, but probably more so for the historical section. And part of that is my fault. I sort of compounded it because Carl doesn't stay in one spot, you know, and we see him in two different time periods himself. So 1943, but then also 1949 and 50. And he moves from Germany to Italy to, you know, and then on board the ship and then finally to Sydney and Adelaide. So each time he moved, I had to do more research for that time period. So there definitely was an extensive amount of research to do for that. But Sandra's absolutely right in that there was a lot of research to do for the contemporary section as well. And this was the first time that I'd written anything that involved a police investigation. So that required a lot of research. And I was lucky enough to have a consultant, but I made sure that I did as much research as I could myself, and then just sort of threw situations and questions at him and said, you know, is this probable? Is this plausible? And luckily, most of the times he said yes, or he would correct me on a small aspect of it. But the contemporary section is also set in 2009, not 2019. So there, even, you know, within that section, there was some research to do. So a lot has changed in Adelaide. Things, you know, for example, the bridge between the Oval and the train station wasn't there back in 2009. So I couldn't have Juliet walking across that bridge. And obviously technology has changed a lot since then. So I needed to make sure that she didn't use technology that wasn't invented yet.
Exactly. Do you enjoy that research part of your writing? Is that, you know, one of the things you enjoy most, or is it the character development or theme development?
I do enjoy the research, and I wasn't sure that I would, and that was maybe one of the things that sort of stopped me from jumping in and starting to write the story in the first place, because I hadn't written any historical fiction before, and I knew that it would take a lot of work. I knew that I needed to get it right, get it as right as possible, so that it really immersed the reader in that time period. But some of it was just so fascinating, especially reading the personal accounts and memoirs of people at the time, and finding those old maps and photographs of places, especially places that I knew, like Adelaide and Sydney, and just being able to picture what it was like then, and seeing the photographs of people, it really brought it to life for me. So I did really enjoy that. The part I enjoy most, do you know, I think the part I enjoy most about writing is the editing process. And
I don't think most people say that.
A lot of people absolutely hate the editing process. But I find first drafts actually really quite difficult to write. And but once I've got something to work with, I just love sort of taking it apart and cutting and pasting and adding to it, and just watching it go from something that's just really raw and not anything that anyone would want to read except for me, and turning it into a real story that's got some merit and that people will enjoy. So yeah, I love that part of it.
I'm just going to ask a a question for myself now, because I always imagine a lot of authors spending a lot of time in libraries looking at through manuscripts and old letters, diaries, even audio recordings. Did you use many of those resources while you were researching?
I did use quite a bit of those resources. A lot of it is actually available online now, which is really, really helpful. I just couldn't imagine doing this kind of research like 50 years ago, when you really had to go through the card catalog and find what you wanted, and you know, spend hours and hours and hours at libraries. But I did definitely spend a fair amount of time at the State Library in particular, going through, as you say, manuscripts and reading personal accounts and listening to a few oral histories. And a lot of time in museums as well, because there's so much information there. And I had the opportunity to go to Germany in 2018 while I was still working on the novel. And so I spent quite a bit of time in museums and really immersing myself in finding out even more about that period of, you know, when Hitler was rising to power, and then the war and the post-war period.
And that information is available in English?
Yes, and yeah, a lot of that is available in English in the museums. There's the GDR Museum in Berlin, which was really fascinating to find out about East Germany and conditions that people were living in then, and being able to relate that to Greta, you know, in her time in the Soviet zone. And also going to Halle and actually walking the streets of the city where Carl grew up, and going to the park where Carl and Greta say their goodbyes, you know, just before he goes to war. So that was really amazing to be able to sort of picture him there and them there, and feel like I was sort of walking in their footsteps, even though they're fictional characters.
Yeah, that's lovely to be able to have that freedom to travel to those places, and it makes the writing more raw and more accurate. So it's been a wonderful experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. One of our panelists is just asking a plot question. How did Carl come to Australia?
How did Carl come to Australia? He came on the Fair Sea. So I don't know if I want to give any more details than that. I don't want to give away any plot spoilers, but he traveled first to Naples in Italy, and then he boarded the migrant ship, the Fair Sea, and traveled on the Fair Sea to, it stopped in Fremantle first and then in Sydney.
Thank you. And Lynette is asking, what was your editing process?
Once it had been contracted to HarperCollins, obviously there was a lot of editing that happened before that, but it wasn't really ready for anybody to see before it got to that stage of being professionally edited. And I tend to write quite, I guess quite spare is how I would describe it, in that my first drafts are not, I don't overwrite, I underwrite. And so most of my editing process is about expanding on things. I had to add a complete chapter in the historical section just to get a little bit more of an idea of who Greta was as a young woman. Expanding a little bit on the relationships between the characters to explore some of those you know, dysfunctional relationships that are happening between her and Lily and the grandparents. And to provide a little bit more backstory on them so that they had more motivation for what they were going through, and so people could relate to them more. So it's those were the biggest things probably. There were lots of other little things as well, but those were the main points of the editing process.
Mm-hmm. And you're probably too modest to mention this, but do you want to tell us a little bit about the Banjo Prize for 2018?
Sure. The Banjo Prize really was announced. It was the first year that the Banjo Prize was put forth by HarperCollins, And it was announced really at the exact right time for me. Had pretty much finished the amount of editing that I could do, and I'd had beta readers give me some feedback on the manuscript, and I thought I was sort of at the stage when it was ready to start sending out to publishers and see if I could find a publisher. And I thought maybe I'd try to find an agent first, even though from what I've heard, it's harder to get an agent than a publishing contract. But I sent it out to a couple of people that other friends had recommended. And while they weren't ready to represent me at that point in time, they were really enthusiastic about the manuscript. It was towards the end of 2017, and I kind of know better than to send things out right before Christmas. So I waited and did a little bit more work on it until the beginning of 2018, and that's when HarperCollins announced their new prize, the Banjo Prize, for an unpublished manuscript of commercial fiction. And I thought, well, Inheritance of Secret just seemed to fit so nicely into that category, and I thought it was pretty much ready. So I sort of very quickly did another run through the manuscript and sent it off probably the second day before submissions closed, and then crossed my fingers. So it didn't win the Banjo Prize, but it was shortlisted, and I was just so excited when I got that email. I must have made some sort of weird sound because my daughter came running out and saying, "Mom, are you okay?" You know, she thought maybe my husband had been in a car accident or something like that. And but yeah, it was just, I was so excited that it had been shortlisted. And while it didn't win, I was offered a contract, and that was just a dream come true. So yeah, it worked out really well.
Exactly. Congratulations. And then we've all got this now.
Yes.
Our little hands. So that's great. Yeah, a lot of authors have spoken about their, that putting their manuscripts into competitions is such a great way to get exposure and contracts. So yeah, that was great.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah. And that was probably part of the reason that really pushed me to enter it, because I did know a couple of authors that had sort of started their publishing career that way, and it just seemed like too good of an opportunity to miss. So, yeah.
But this isn't the start of your publishing career. You have been published as a children's author in Canada. How was it to move from writing for children to writing for adults?
It seems like a huge leap to go from children's fiction to a crime thriller. And again, I think that was part of what sort of made me take so long to decide to write the novel, that it just seemed like such a huge task. At the time that I had the idea, I was writing really quite short chapter books. The things that I had published, the books I had published were basically 5,000 to 8,000 words for year 1 or 2 students, and then after that I started writing high interest, low reading level novels for reluctant readers in the teen years. So those are quite short as well, 20 to 25,000 words. So to write something as big and as complex as I knew this was going to be, especially with all the historical research that would be involved in everything, it seemed like just a really huge task. But then, that idea just wouldn't go away. And so I knew that I wanted to write about it. And once I made the decision, I just tackled it one piece at a time, like I did any other piece of writing, scene by scene, chapter by chapter. And eventually the word count adds up. And in a sense, writing an adult novel was almost a little bit liberating, because writing for children, everything has to be written so tight. You have such a short word count, and every word has to have a purpose. You need to start right at the beginning, right in the action, and make sure that there's lots of engagement and incentive for children to keep turning the pages, especially for those young adult novels that I was writing for reluctant teens. They're not people that ordinarily pick up a book. And so you have to have those chapter hooks at the end of each chapter and get them invested in the characters to make them want to read on. And when I started after I'd written the first draft of Inheritance of Secrets and started looking back at it, I thought, well, those are the exact same skills that I needed to write Inheritance of Secrets. It starts at the beginning, right in the action, and it makes the readers invest in the characters and want to turn the pages and read the next chapter. So it wasn't actually as different as I had made out in my imagination.
You were talking about, writing scene by scene, chapter by chapter. So are you a plotter or a pantser? And maybe for our viewers, you might like to define pantser.
Sure. So a plotter is someone who outlines the plot ahead of time. It's pretty self-explanatory. But a pantser is someone who gets an idea and basically just starts writing, writing from the seat of their pants, basically, which is why they call it a pantser. And I am more of a pantser than a plotter. I do pretty much all the time know the beginning and know the end, but all those bits in the middle really develop as I'm writing. So I don't have a clear outline of the storyline before I start. Yeah, for the historical section with Carl, perhaps I did a little bit more because of who he is. I knew that he was a German soldier, and I knew that he was going to migrate to Australia, and I knew it would be about his journey from Germany to Adelaide. So I had a very, very broad outline for that. But for the contemporary section, aside from the fact that I knew Juliet had to be an integral part of finding out the mystery, and I knew there had to be some sort of police investigation, then I knew that was basically all I knew. So, yeah.
It's such an interesting way of writing, almost kind of feeling your way in the dark as opposed to, planning a journey, I guess, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
A couple of questions from our viewers. They ask, have your parents read the story?
No, well, okay, unfortunately, both my parents have passed away now. So
I'm sorry to hear that, Sonia.
That's all right. They obviously haven't read the finished novel. My dad did read a few of the early chapters and, gave me a little bit of feedback on it. I was probably about 2/3 of the way finished, and he had read most of that. And we had talked some, not so much about his own history because it's not something he ever wanted to talk about, but we did talk when I would go to Canada and visit him just about Carl and the experiences that he might have had growing up, and how he might have dealt with certain situations. And yeah, he did read a portion of the manuscript, so that was good to be able to share it with him.
Thank you for sharing that. I did read in the back in your acknowledgements, but I just thought I'd ask that question on behalf of one of our viewers. So thank you for that. Sandra asks, do you think you need to have a good idea of the plot before going overseas to research, or did that travel spur the ideas?
That's a good question. The travel that I did to Germany was after I'd written the complete novel. So I had already finished the manuscript, and it had been contracted to HarperCollins. It was just in the process of being contracted to HarperCollins when I went to Germany. So I didn't go there specifically to research. I do have extended family there, and obviously my dad is German, and I hadn't actually been to Germany before, which is really a bit sad when you consider that that's my heritage. So my sister and I went to Germany, and my husband and her partner as well, really to sort of explore our own roots. And it was a really good opportunity to do some research, extended research for the novel as well, going into that editing process. Yeah. But I do know lots of authors do that, but I think you have to be very, very confident in your abilities to pull it off, to actually have a specific research trip, to an international destination. I would certainly, I love to travel, and I have done quite a bit of international travel. So I would certainly do it in conjunction with a trip that I had already planned for pleasure. But I haven't yet made that leap to saying, I'm going to write this novel, and so I'm going to go to this place to research it. Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of future novels, I'm just going to just invite our attendees, before I ask someone to give us a sneak peek into her next project. I'd like to invite you to ask any questions via the Q&A box below. So one of our attendees asked, is there a follow-up novel given the way the story ends?
Oh. The next novel that I'm working on is not a follow-up novel to this one. It's a completely separate one. There are a couple of ideas floating around, but I'm not sure whether I'll explore them or not. So yeah, it is a little bit open to having a follow-up, but yeah, there's nothing planned at this point in time.
Okay. On your website, you did mention a couple of projects that you had going, maybe even a younger reader, young adult book.
Is that the middle grade science fiction one?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yes. So I've been working on that one for a little while. I've put it aside for now. That was just something that was really, really fun to write, and I collaborated a little bit with my brother on all the technical aspects, because he's a pilot, and he's a computer scientist, and he's into all that sort of thing, and has a lot more knowledge about it than I do. But it's a really sort of fun, adventurous kind of science fiction middle grade novel, and I hope it goes somewhere someday. But at this point, it's in the bottom drawer for a little while until I have some time to do a little bit more work on it. And then I am working on another adult novel that is. I've probably got around 30,000 words written, and it's sort of on hold while I'm doing some promotion for Inheritance of Secrets, and during all this COVID craziness as well. While some people have been really unfortunately out of work, my work has escalated just because everything has to go online now instead of being face to face, and so that takes a whole lot of managing and learning new skills and reworking things. So just haven't had the time to continue working on it for now.
Well, Sonya, it's been really lovely speaking to you tonight. Just to finish off, I recently read a reviewer noting that this novel is a fast-paced thriller, but what really makes it shine is the history that underpins the plot. So I think you can be very happy with how you've woven this story together. Not many novelists have tackled life after World War II for a German soldier. So this narrative makes for a really enlightening novel for our attendees today. So if you haven't read the novel yet, I highly recommend Inheritance of Secrets. Now, for those of you, this is what the cover looks like in case you were.
Both sides.
For those of you who prefer to listen to audiobooks, I'd like to mention the audio version of Inheritance of Secrets. It's read beautifully and skillfully by Jennifer Bolektik. She reads so well with and does the accents and beautiful expression. So, Sonya, did you get a chance to listen to any of it?
I've listened to a portion of it, yes,
Yeah.
of the whole thing, and yes, she does an absolutely brilliant job. I'm just so thrilled that it's out in audio as well as in paperback and ebook.
Yeah, and just the accents and from Russians, Germans, Australians.
Yeah.
It's all very, very good. So captures the characters really well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so Sonya, thank you so much for your time tonight, and we wish you every success as word of mouth spreads on Inheritance of Secrets. And to our listeners tonight, thank you so much for joining us online, and I hope you've enjoyed our time with Sonya. author of Inheritance of Secrets. So please follow Burnside Library on Facebook and Instagram, and keep checking our website for upcoming author events. Next Tuesday afternoon, we'll be chatting with author Danielle Binks, who will speak about her novel, The Year the Maps Changed. This story is set in 1999, when 400 Kosovar Albanian refugees arrive in the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. So thank you all very much for being with us tonight. I hope you have a lovely evening, and we'll see you soon.
And thank you so much, Kate, for having me on. It's really been fun, and thank you to all the people that have tuned in.
You're welcome. And we've just got a few people who have said, I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you for the chat.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonya. Good night.
Okay, good night.